Why are you here?
Rebecca Montgomery never imagined her life would end up in this mess. But then again, she never expected to be married to James Mitchell either. Not a man of humble beginnings, but a man who took more pride in his reputation than in the life they were supposed to build together. It was the morning of their divorce, and as Rebecca sat in her car parked just outside the hospital, a place James had worked tirelessly to rise to the top, her heart had already broken. Her fingers clenched the divorce papers he'd served her hours earlier, the ink still fresh, like the wounds he'd inflicted upon her soul. This wasn't the life she'd imagined, and yet she was about to make the decision that would change everything. The hospital, St. Anani's Memorial, wasn't just a medical institution. It was the Mitchell family's legacy. James's grandfather had built it, proudly carrying the name, the honor, the respect. Rebecca had never really cared about it. She had only cared about James, the man she thought she knew. But the betrayal had been coming for months. The photos, the texts, the lies. He wasn't the man she'd married. He was someone she'd barely recognized. Rebecca's phone buzzed. She glanced at it briefly, her lawyer's name flashing across the screen. She didn't pick up. The decision had already been made. Today, James would see just how little he knew her. Her eyes turned toward the hospital entrance, where James stood with Elena, his mistress, locked in a passionate kiss. She saw it from the corner of her eye as she sat in her modest Honda Civic, the very same car that James had mocked for being cheap. It wasn't a symbol of her inability to afford better. It was a symbol of her refusal to be swallowed by a man who would only love her for the money he thought she didn't have. Rebecca's heart clenched, not from the sight of betrayal, but from the realization of what she had known all along. James was no longer the man she had married, and the truth of who she really was, that she wasn't just a woman in a cheap dress, the one he belittled for years, was about to surface. She turned the ignition on, her hand steady as she set the car into drive. The hospital was waiting for her, but more importantly, James was waiting for the reckoning he never saw coming. James Mitchell, meanwhile, was basking in the glow of a victory he thought he'd won. He had it all, his career, a beautiful wife, and now, Elena by his side. He'd walked away from the marriage with a sense of triumph, feeling liberated. But even in his so-called freedom, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Rebecca hadn't even put up a fight. He brushed it off. She was no longer his concern. The life he was building with Elena was everything he wanted. She understood him. She didn't question his ambition, didn't nag him about the long hours he worked. Unlike Rebecca, who'd always been too focused on her quiet life, Elena was ready to enjoy the fruits of his success. It was as if the universe had finally rewarded him for his hard work. But he didn't realize that the universe was about to deliver a different kind of lesson. Rebecca arrived at St. Anani's Memorial, walking confidently into the hospital lobby with the divorce papers still clutched in her hand. The fluorescent lights above hummed, almost mocking her calm demeanor. She had no fear in her eyes, only a deep, unshakable resolve. Her goal was simple: to make sure that James would never forget what he'd done, to make sure his arrogance would cost him everything he valued. She had already put everything into motion. The Mitchells didn't know the truth about her, and that was a secret weapon she had been waiting to unleash. Rebecca's humble appearance, the thrift store clothes, the modest demeanor, had been the perfect disguise. While James had been busy building his life around his inflated ego, she had been working quietly behind the scenes, ensuring that she would be the one to control their future. Her first stop was the hospital's administrative office. She handed over the ownership transfer documents to the receptionist, who didn't recognize her at first. But that quickly changed when Rebecca introduced herself as the new owner of St. Anani's Memorial. The receptionist's eyes widened as she scanned the paperwork. Her voice faltered as she realized she was speaking to someone far more powerful than she could have imagined. Rebecca turned to leave, her gaze lingering on the elevator, where she knew James would soon be. He had no idea what was about to unfold. James, on the other hand, was caught up in his own false sense of superiority. He had just finished a round of meetings, dealing with hospital management and preparing for the board meeting. Everything was in place for his next big step. He would continue to climb, leaving Rebecca behind in his wake. But as he stood in the elevator, heading back to his office, he felt a strange chill run down his spine. It was as if the universe was giving him a warning he couldn't ignore. When he stepped off the elevator, everything around him seemed to slow. He glanced across the hall and saw Rebecca, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. In that instant, everything inside him froze. But before he could react, Elena whispered something in his ear, snapping him back to his self-absorbed world. He shook it off and proceeded to the administrative office. But as he walked past the reception desk, the air in the room felt different. Something had shifted. As Rebecca made her way to the hospital's top floor, she couldn't help but smile. James had been so consumed with his own image, so desperate for validation from his mother and colleagues, that he had failed to see the subtle signs of her quiet power. The wealth she had hidden, the investments she had made, and the legal steps she had taken, none of it had been a fluke. It had all been calculated. Now, as the labor pains began to intensify, she knew that her plan was in motion. James, the man who had walked over her in her most vulnerable moment, would soon find himself helpless. His empire would crumble in front of him, and all of his misdeeds would be exposed. Rebecca wasn't just fighting for her daughter. She was fighting for herself, and for every woman who had ever been underestimated. By the time Rebecca was in the delivery room, the staff had been alerted. Her lawyers had already taken action, and her legal team was on standby, ready to dismantle James's life piece by piece. This was just the beginning. The truth would soon be revealed, and James Mitchell would be left with nothing but the consequences of his actions. Rebecca's phone buzzed. It was from her lawyer. The termination notice has been delivered. Fraud charges are filed. Your control over everything is already in motion. She looked up at the ceiling, feeling a sense of peace. Her daughter was coming into the world, and the reckoning she had prepared for was finally unfolding. As Rebecca lay in the hospital bed, the world outside seemed to disappear, leaving only the sounds of medical equipment and her steady breathing. The pain was intense, but she barely felt it anymore. The only thing that mattered now was the quiet triumph of everything she had planned for. Her baby was coming, and with her, the final act of her carefully orchestrated revenge. James, the man who had once promised to love her forever, was no longer part of her world. He had thought she was just another woman who needed him to survive. But Rebecca had always known the truth. She was stronger than he could ever imagine. The first few hours after her water broke had been a blur of doctors, nurses, and her legal team handling the initial paperwork. But now, in the solitude of her room, she had a moment to herself. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a strange sense of peace. She knew that her revenge wasn't about the destruction of James's career or reputation. It was about something deeper. It was about the power to walk away from a life built on false promises and toxic expectations. Her phone buzzed again. It was her lawyer, David. Everything's in motion. We filed the fraud charges. The termination notice is live, and the media release will hit in 30 minutes. James is already getting the first wave of fallout. I've also set up the press conference for tomorrow. It's time. Rebecca smiled to herself. The timing was perfect. The world would know the truth, and James would be left scrambling. The money, the power, the hospital, everything he had once taken for granted would be stripped away in an instant. He would be forced to confront his own arrogance. And for the first time, he would see her as the woman he had underestimated. She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the quiet before the storm. Outside the hospital, in the parking garage, James was pacing. The events of the day had been surreal, and his mind couldn't keep up. He had received the email from his lawyer, notifying him of the charges filed against him. Fraud, theft, patient abandonment. Terms that felt like they didn't belong in his world. How had it come to this? How had he gone from being the golden boy of St. Anani's Memorial to a man facing the collapse of everything he'd worked for? Elena had already left. Her departure had been quiet, almost too quiet. He thought she would stay, but as soon as she realized the gravity of the situation, she had vanished. Gone were the promises of a future together. Gone was the image of a perfect life. Now, there was only the cold, harsh reality of what he had done. He glanced at his phone, staring at the barrage of missed calls and emails. His mother's name flashed across the screen. He didn't bother answering. He couldn't handle her right now. The truth was, he didn't know who to trust anymore. As he got into his car, the reality of his situation began to settle in. He had just been kicked out of the hospital he had spent his entire career building. The email from the medical board, the message from his bank, the calls from his lawyer, all filled with a mix of dread and frustration. And then there was Rebecca, the woman he had divorced, the woman he had stepped over in the hospital earlier that day. The irony was too much to bear. Back inside the hospital, Rebecca's condition was worsening. The pain had become unbearable, but she still maintained her composure. Her team was already in place, handling the legalities and the media fallout. They were prepared for the storm that was about to hit, but Rebecca couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. She had done what she needed to do. Now, all she had to do was wait. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her assistant. The press conference is set for tomorrow morning. The hospital's new ownership will be announced, and the media will be briefed on your actions. The Mitchell family is already scrambling, and the press is eager for a statement. Rebecca nodded, taking a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. But as the pain of labor intensified, her mind drifted back to the years she had spent with James. The moments of false hope, the promises he had made, only to break them, the way he had slowly changed, becoming someone she barely recognized. She had tried to be the perfect wife, but nothing was ever enough for him. Nothing would have ever been enough. She had to admit that the hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't the affair, the lies, or the abandonment. It was the realization that she had given so much of herself to a man who never truly saw her, who never truly valued her. Her thoughts were interrupted by another contraction, stronger than the last. She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the sides of the bed. The pain was overwhelming, but she focused on her breathing, reminding herself that this moment would soon pass. What mattered now was the future she had built, the future that would no longer include James. Meanwhile, James was sitting in his car, still processing the day's events. He had just received another email, this time from his mother. The subject line was enough to make him freeze. "Did you know?" He opened it without hesitation. "James, call me now." "That woman, Rebecca, isn't who we thought. I just got a call from the hospital. They're investigating me for embezzlement from the Mitchell Family Foundation. They're saying I've been stealing for 18 months. And your wife, your ex-wife, the hospital is saying she owns it now. They're saying she's Rebecca Montgomery. The Montgomery family, pharmaceuticals, billions of dollars. James, did you marry a billionaire and not know it?" James stared at the screen in disbelief. Rebecca, his ex-wife, had been hiding her wealth, her power, her influence, all along. The woman he had discarded as weak and insignificant was not only stronger than him, but she had been silently orchestrating his downfall from the very beginning. His mind raced. How could he have been so blind? How could he have not seen what was right in front of him? Back in the hospital, Rebecca felt a sense of finality wash over her. James was learning the truth, and the consequences of his actions were now inevitable. But even in her pain, there was a sense of satisfaction. She had waited for this moment for so long, and now it was happening. As she looked down at her growing belly, she couldn't help but feel a rush of love for the life she was about to bring into the world. This child would grow up knowing the truth. They would know that their mother was strong, strategic, and powerful. They would know that justice had been served. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from David. "Rebecca, it's done. The Mitchells are finished. James has lost everything. We're releasing the press statement tomorrow. The world will know the truth." Rebecca smiled softly, her eyes glistening with tears. She was ready to embrace the new chapter of her life, ready to watch James face the consequences of his actions, ready to move on and rebuild. The moment of reckoning had come. The early morning light filtered through the hospital windows, casting a soft glow across the sterile room. Rebecca lay in her bed, her body exhausted, but her spirit unwavering. She had delivered her daughter, Lillian Mitchell, just a few hours ago, an unexpected arrival, premature but strong. In the quiet moments between contractions, between the quiet cooing of her newborn, Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought her here. It had been a path filled with pain, betrayal, and doubt, but it had also been a journey of strength, quiet power, and patience. And now, as she held Lily close, she couldn't help but feel that everything, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every tear, had been worth it. The door to the room opened softly, and Rebecca looked up to see Dorothy, the head nurse, walking in. Her calm demeanor brought a small sense of comfort to Rebecca, who had been feeling a mix of exhaustion and anticipatory excitement for the day to come. "Rebecca," Dorothy said quietly, "how are you feeling this morning?" "Better," Rebecca replied, her voice steady but soft. "Tired, but better." Dorothy smiled and pulled up a chair beside the bed. "Your daughter is a fighter. I've been in this hospital for years, and I've seen a lot of premature births, but she's already showing incredible strength. She's going to be just fine." Rebecca's heart swelled with pride as she looked down at the tiny bundle in her arms. "I've always known she would be strong," she said softly. "I just had to get her to this point." Dorothy gave her a knowing look. "It's been a long road for you, hasn't it?" Rebecca nodded, her eyes clouding with memories. 3 years, Dorothy. 3 years of trying to make it work. But the moment James stepped over my wheelchair yesterday, I realized I couldn't keep trying. It was over. Dorothy's expression softened. "You've made the right decision. I've seen James, and I've seen you. You're better off without him." Rebecca glanced out the window, her thoughts briefly drifting to the man who had once been her husband. It was hard to believe how much had changed in just a few hours. The woman who had once felt powerless, who had spent so much of her time trying to please James and his family, was now in complete control of her life. The future was hers, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. Meanwhile, James was sitting in a small, nondescript apartment, staring at the phone screen in front of him. He hadn't slept in nearly 24 hours, and the weight of everything that had happened seemed to be crashing down on him all at once. He had thought Rebecca was nothing, just a woman who wasn't good enough for him. But in a matter of hours, his entire world had collapsed. The emails, the phone calls, the legal notices, they were all reminders of how he had miscalculated, how he had allowed his arrogance to blind him to the truth. Rebecca had been right all along. She wasn't just some helpless woman he could walk over. She had been silently building her empire while he was busy fooling himself into thinking he was untouchable. He had heard from his lawyer just an hour ago. His medical license had been suspended. His bank accounts were frozen. And worst of all, the press was already picking up on the story. The Mitchell family's fall from grace was happening in real time, and there was nothing James could do to stop it. His mind kept returning to the image of Rebecca in the hospital, sitting there in that wheelchair, her eyes filled with hurt and disappointment. The moment he stepped over her, the moment he chose Elena over her, it was a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. But the regret was only a small part of the larger realization. He had destroyed everything he had worked for, and it was all his fault. Back at the hospital, Rebecca's legal team had already set their plan into motion. They had begun drafting the press release, which would be sent out to media later that afternoon. It would confirm Rebecca's new ownership of St. Anani's Memorial Hospital and include a statement detailing the unethical behavior of her ex-husband, James Mitchell, and his family. The documents were airtight, and Rebecca's legal team had worked tirelessly to ensure everything was in place. Rebecca wasn't concerned about the fallout. She had anticipated this moment for years. James's career, his reputation, everything he had worked so hard to build, was crumbling, and it wasn't because she wanted revenge. It was because the universe had a way of delivering justice, and Rebecca had simply been the instrument to make sure it was served. She hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. She hadn't wanted to destroy James. But what he had done to her, the emotional abuse, the financial manipulation, the neglect, was unforgivable. And as much as she had tried to make things work, as much as she had held on to hope, she knew now that she had to let go. Rebecca wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor. And now she was the one in control. James received a call this afternoon. It was from his mother, Patricia. He had avoided her all morning, but he couldn't ignore her anymore. His phone rang again, this time with a text from Elena, who had been trying to reach him since he'd left her in the restaurant. He didn't respond to either of them. Instead, he turned on the news. The headline read, Rebecca Mitchell becomes owner of St. Anani's Memorial Hospital. Ex-husband James Mitchell under investigation for misconduct. James felt his stomach drop. The article went on to detail the charges against him, including patient abandonment, fraud, and the ongoing investigation into the Mitchell family's finances. There was no escaping the reality now. The world knew the truth. He sat there for a moment, staring at the screen. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his attorney. You need to come in. The DA wants to meet. This is getting worse. The walls seemed to close in on him. He had lost everything. His career, his reputation, his future. And worst of all, he had lost Rebecca, the one person who had ever truly cared for him. In the hospital, Rebecca could hear the sound of her baby's steady heartbeat on the monitor beside her. The rhythmic sound was comforting, a reminder that even in the chaos of her life, something pure and beautiful had come from all the pain. She had worked hard to get to this point. She had fought for everything she had. And now, as she looked down at her newborn daughter, she knew that the battle had just begun. But for the first time in years, Rebecca felt at peace. She had no regrets. Her daughter, Lily, was the future, and with her, Rebecca would build a new life, one that was free from the constraints of James's manipulation, free from the toxic hold of the Mitchell family, and free from a man who had once claimed her heart. The sun had barely risen over the city, but Rebecca was already in motion. The calm, quiet serenity of her hospital room had quickly faded as the outside world rushed in, bringing with it the storm of attention that she had known would come. Rebecca hadn't been naive. She knew that once the press release went live, once the truth about James and his family's corruption came to light, there would be no going back. But she was prepared. Her legal team had done its job. The evidence against James was irrefutable, and the media had already begun to run stories. Headlines blare across every major news outlet. Billionaire wife turns the tables. Hospital heir's divorce becomes public scandal. In the span of a single day, James's life had fallen apart. The press conference would happen soon, and Rebecca would stand tall at the helm of a new chapter, one where she was no longer the victim but the architect of her own destiny. The faint sound of her baby's soft coos beside her was a grounding reminder of why she had done all of this. Lillian Mitchell, her daughter, was her future. Everything she had done, every tear she had shed, every insult she had quietly absorbed over the years, had been leading to this moment. The door creaked open, and David, her lead attorney, stepped inside. His face was calm, but there was an urgency in his eyes. The pressure of everything happening in real time had to be wearing on him too, but it was clear from his posture that he was in control. "How are you holding up?" he asked, glancing at the sleeping infant in Rebecca's arms. Rebecca gave him a soft smile. "Better than I thought I'd be. The baby's healthy. The rest of it, we'll see." David nodded. "The media is eating it up. The Mitchells are already scrambling. James's lawyer is demanding a meeting, and his mother's camp is fighting back with damage control tactics. I don't think they fully realize how deep this is going to go." Rebecca's eyes darkened. "They will. They'll all realize it when the truth hits hard enough to leave them no place to hide." David hesitated for a moment. "I have to ask, Rebecca, are you sure you're ready to go public with everything? The media, the charges, there's no going back from this. Once the press conference is over, the world will know everything about you, about them." She looked at him squarely, her gaze unwavering. "It's already public, David. The world is already watching. They can't erase what's already happened. But I'm not just doing this for the headlines. I'm doing it because James thought he could get away with everything. But this is what happens when someone like him steps over the wrong person." David let out a deep breath. "I'm with you. Let's get this done, then. You'll be able to stand in front of them, legally and morally right, and in control of your future." Meanwhile, in his cramped apartment, James Mitchell was pacing, his mind a chaotic mess of guilt, disbelief, and panic. The weight of everything that had happened over the past 48 hours had crushed him. He had tried to ignore it, tried to run from the consequences, but now the fallout had come for him. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the knowledge that the walls were closing in on him. Every call, every text, every news story, it all served to remind him of the destruction he had wrought. His career, his reputation, his life, all of it was gone. And for what? For a fleeting affair with a woman who had now walked out his life just as quickly as she had entered it. He had thought he was untouchable. But the moment he had chosen Elena over Rebecca, the moment he had stepped over her in that hospital, he had sealed his fate. His phone buzzed, snapping him back to reality. It was his lawyer again, demanding an immediate meeting. James barely had the strength to answer, but he did. "James, we need to talk. It's bad. The charges are coming. The DA is pushing for a full investigation into your finances. They've subpoenaed everything. And the medical board? They've suspended your license. It's over." James gripped the phone tighter. "What the hell am I supposed to do now?" His lawyer's voice was sharp, no longer the calm reassurance he was used to. "Get a grip. You've made the situation worse by trying to hide things. The more you try to run, the more they're going to come for you. You need to make a decision now. Are you going to fight this, or are you going to cut your losses and try to save what's left?" James leaned back, his mind spinning. He had always been able to manipulate his way out of situations before. But this time, he was facing something far bigger than he could control. His wealth, his career, his very identity. It was all crumbling, and it was all his fault. Back at the hospital, Rebecca was preparing for the moment she had been waiting for. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m., and the hospital's boardroom was set up to accommodate the cameras, reporters, and journalists who would be present. It was a monumental moment, not just for Rebecca, but for the future of St. Anani's Memorial. As she sat in her room, Her thoughts went back to the days before everything fell apart, before the affair, before betrayal, before James's arrogance had seeped into every aspect of their marriage. She had tried so hard to make it work. But now, the mask had been lifted, and the truth was finally going to be revealed. She checked her phone again. Her legal team was handling the final details. The press release was going live in moments. She was ready for it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Dorothy again, the nurse who'd been so kind to her during her time in the hospital. "How's the baby?" Dorothy asked with a gentle smile. "Perfect," Rebecca replied. "She's healthy and strong." Dorothy nodded. "You know, I've worked here for a long time. I've seen a lot of doctors and families come and go. But what you're doing right now, Rebecca, standing up like this, after everything's put you through, it's going to mean something to a lot of people. You've been through hell, and yet you're standing here in control of your future. It's inspiring." Rebecca's lips curled into a small smile. "I didn't do it for inspiration. I did it because I had no choice. I couldn't let him destroy me. I had to rebuild. And I did." Dorothy squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of the journey Rebecca had taken. In another part of the city, James sat alone in his car, staring at the hospital from a distance. He had come here to confront Rebecca, to beg her for mercy, to make her understand that he had never meant for things to go this far. But he knew deep down that it was pointless. He couldn't undo the damage he had caused. He had made too many mistakes, hurt too many people. And now, the consequences were about to hit him with the force of a tidal wave. As he turned the car around, heading back to his temporary apartment, he realized something. This wasn't just about Rebecca anymore. This was about him. This was about facing the consequences of the life he had built on lies, arrogance, and self-delusion. Rebecca was ready. The moment had arrived. The world was watching. As she stepped into the boardroom, the reporters turned their cameras toward her, ready to capture the woman who had become both a symbol of power and of moral justice. But as the first questions began to fly, Rebecca felt nothing but calm. She had done what needed to be done. The rest was out of her hands. Her voice was steady as she addressed the room. "I am Rebecca Montgomery, and today marks the beginning of a new chapter, not just for me, but for St. Anani's Memorial Hospital. This hospital was built on values of integrity, compassion, and service. And I am here today to ensure that those values are restored, not just in the walls of this institution, but in the lives of every person who has been affected by the actions of those who put their ambition ahead of their duty." Rebecca's eyes locked with the camera, her voice unwavering. "Today, the Mitchell family's era ends, and a new era of leadership begins." The following days blurred together in a whirlwind of media coverage, legal meetings, and personal reflection. Rebecca had prepared for the aftermath of her decision to take control of her life. But even she was surprised by the speed with which everything unfolded. The press conference had ignited a media firestorm. Headlines about James Mitchell's fall from grace were everywhere. The Mitchell family scandal was trending on every social platform, and whispers about Rebecca's true identity, her wealth, her strategy, her quiet power, were everywhere. Rebecca had expected the backlash. After all, there were always those who would seek to discredit her, to diminish her accomplishments. But what she hadn't anticipated was how quickly the tide had turned in her favor. The media, once enamored with James's career and his family's legacy, now painted him as the villain. His arrogance, his cruelty, and his betrayal had left him exposed, stripped of the respect he'd once commanded. Rebecca knew this moment wouldn't last forever. The world's attention span was fleeting, and the spotlight would inevitably shift to the next scandal or headline. But for now, this was her victory. This was her time. As she sat in her office at the hospital, reviewing the mountain of paperwork in front of her, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from David, her lawyer. She'd grown used to his frequent updates, but this one made her pause. Rebecca, I know you've been focused on the hospital, but we need to talk. James's team is moving fast. They're preparing to counterattack, and it's more than just a legal defense. His mother's press contacts are already spreading rumors. There's talk about filing for full custody of your daughter. This isn't over yet. Rebecca exhaled sharply, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had known that the fight would be long, that James and his mother would do everything in their power to undermine her. But she had already planned for this moment. The legal team was prepared, and the evidence they had collected was airtight. What they didn't know was that Rebecca's greatest asset was her patience. She replied quickly, "I'm ready. Let them come. We'll meet them head on. But I need to know everything they're planning. No surprises." David's response was immediate. "I'll keep you updated. But we need to start preparing for the worst. If they're serious about the custody battle, it could get ugly." Meanwhile, James was sitting in a bar, nursing a drink as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. His mind was a haze of regret and disbelief. Every part of his life had been stripped away. The hospital, his career, his future, all of it was gone. And now, as he stared at the half-empty glass in front of him, he couldn't help but wonder how it had all gone so wrong. The email from his mother still burned in his mind. She had urged him to call her immediately after reading it, but he hadn't been able to bring himself to. Patricia had always been the person who controlled everything, and now she was watching his life unravel in real time. The world had gone from respecting him to condemning him, and the weight of it felt like a heavy stone around his neck. He'd tried to talk to Elena, but even she was pulling away. The minute the truth had come out about Rebecca's wealth, Elena had become distant. She'd stayed for a while, offering sympathy, but now she was gone. She had her own career to think about, and James wasn't part of her plans anymore. James looked down at his phone, which had been buzzing constantly since yesterday. His lawyer's name flashed on the screen. He knew it was only a matter of time before the legal battles began. The fraud charges, the theft, the patient abandonment. The press coverage had made it all worse. Rebecca had not only made sure the world knew what he'd done, but she had ensured the consequences would follow him for the rest of his life. The phone buzzed again, and this time James answered it. "James, we need to meet. The DA wants to talk to you. They're considering charging you with criminal fraud. They've got the evidence. The Mitchell family is on the brink of financial collapse. Your name is mud in the press. We can't fix this if you don't take action." James ran a hand through his hair, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want me to do? How do I fix this?" His lawyer's tone softened, but it didn't make reality any less harsh. "You need to cooperate with the investigation. You need to show remorse. The longer you fight this, the worse it will be. You have to prove you're willing to make things right." James hung up the phone and stared at it for a long moment. He had nothing left. No career, no respect, no future. He had been so blind, so consumed by his own ego that he had destroyed everything that mattered. Back at the hospital, Rebecca's mind was far from idle. The quiet victory she had achieved with the press release was only the first step. The real battle was about to begin. Her thoughts drifted back to James and the years they had spent together. She had loved him once, deeply and completely. But now, that love felt like a distant memory, a naive version of herself that no longer existed. In its place stood a woman who had learned to fight for herself, who had learned that silence and patience could be more powerful than any confrontation. She looked down at Lily, her daughter, now sleeping peacefully in her arms. Her heart swelled with love for the tiny life that had come into the world under such tumultuous circumstances. This little girl would grow up knowing the truth. She would grow up with the knowledge that her mother had fought for her, not just in the quiet moments of planning, but in the grand gestures that would shape their future. Rebecca's phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't from David. It was from her mother's lawyer, an unexpected contact that caught her attention. "Rebecca, I know you've had a lot on your plate, but we need to discuss the next steps. There's been some recent developments regarding James's custody battle. It looks like he's prepared to fight this to the end." Rebecca read the message and sighed. The reality of the situation was settling in. The custody battle was about to get uglier, and James wasn't going to back down easily. But she wasn't afraid. She had already won the first round. James's arrogance, his manipulation, and his cruelty had been exposed for all to see. And now, as she sat there with her daughter in her arms, she knew that the next stage of the battle would be even more intense. The fight for Lily's future, for her own future, was just beginning. But this time, Rebecca would be the one holding all the cards. As James sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through news articles about Rebecca's rise, he felt a wave of panic wash over him. The reality was setting in, and it was worse than he could have imagined. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. He had brought this upon himself. Every lie, every betrayal, every wrong decision, it had led him here. And now, with everything crumbling, he was finally facing the consequences of his actions. The world wasn't going to forgive him. And Rebecca was already moving on without him. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm golden hue over the city as Rebecca sat by the window in her hospital suite, gazing out at the skyline. Her mind had been racing for days, processing everything that had happened, everything that was still unfolding. She could feel the weight of her new reality. She wasn't just a woman scorned. She was a force to be reckoned with. And for the first time, she truly understood what it meant to be in control of her own destiny. The news had already begun circulating. The hospital was officially under new ownership, and the Mitchell family was facing a monumental public and financial collapse. James, once the golden boy of St. Anani's Memorial, was now the villain in a scandal that no one could have predicted. His arrogance had been his undoing, and Rebecca had made sure the world knew it. The press was hungry for every detail, every sordid piece of information about the Mitchells' downfall. But for Rebecca, it was never about the public spectacle. It wasn't about revenge, even though the world might see it that way. It was about justice. It was about showing the world that the person who had been abused, manipulated, and discarded could rise above it all. She wasn't just reclaiming what was hers. She was reclaiming her identity, her power, and her future. But as much as she'd come to embrace this new chapter, there were still obstacles in her path. The custody battle loomed large, and she knew that James wasn't done fighting. He had always been driven by his ego, and he would do whatever it took to prove that he hadn't lost everything. Rebecca's phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was David, her attorney. "Rebecca, we need to talk. The Mitchells are escalating their attempts to regain control. They're hiring top-tier lawyers, and James has been seen making deals with private investigators. It's clear he's trying to play dirty." Rebecca didn't flinch. This was to be expected. James wouldn't let go of the life he had once taken for granted without a fight. But what he didn't understand was that the power had already shifted. She wasn't the woman he had discarded anymore. She wasn't the quiet, demure wife who had been content to stand in the shadows. She was a billionaire in her own right, a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up, and she was ready to fight for what was rightfully hers, her daughter's future, her legacy, and her peace of mind. She replied to David's message, "I'm ready. We won't let him take anything from me again." James sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. He had never felt so powerless in his life. The once promising career he had built was now in tatters. His medical license was suspended. His bank account were frozen. His reputation was in ruins, and the world had turned its back on him, all because of a single mistake. a mistake he couldn't undo. He had tried to get in touch with Rebecca, but she wasn't answering his calls. Elena had stopped returning his texts. His mother, Patricia, had left him to fend for himself, her support fading as quickly as his fortune. The only person who had ever truly believed in him, besides his mother, was now the one person he could no longer reach. James's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his lawyer. The DA has filed criminal charges. They're pushing for a plea deal. We need to move quickly. James closed his eyes, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. He had betrayed Rebecca in the worst possible way. He had stepped over her in her moment of need. He had humiliated her, and now the consequences were crashing down on him. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Rebecca had been the one person who had always supported him, always believed in him, even when he didn't deserve it, and he had thrown that away. Now, all he could do was hope that somehow someone would help him out of this mess. But deep down, he knew that his actions had set everything in motion. He had to face the consequences, no matter how much it hurt. Back at the hospital, Rebecca was preparing for the final stages of her battle. She had already secured Lily's future. Her daughter would grow up in a world where she would never have to rely on anyone for validation. But the battle for her legal rights wasn't over. She knew that James would not give up easily. He still had his pride, and that made him dangerous. Rebecca had a meeting scheduled with her legal team that afternoon. She needed to be ready for the fight ahead. But as she sat in her office, looking out at the city, she realized that the fight wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been belittled, dismissed, or underestimated. It was for every person who had ever been made to feel small by someone they loved. She was standing up for all of them, and she wasn't going to back down. The door opened, and David stepped inside. His expression was grim, but there was a determination in his eyes. He had been with her every step of the way, and Rebecca trusted him implicitly. "We need to talk," David said, his voice steady. "James's team is already preparing a counterattack. They're going for full custody of Lily. They'll stop at nothing to make sure they get what they want. But we have everything we need to fight them." Rebecca nodded. "I won't let them take her. Lily's future is mine to protect. I'm not afraid of them anymore." David smiled, but there was a touch of admiration in his eyes. "You've done everything right, Rebecca. We'll get through this." James's desperation grew with each passing hour. The walls around him were closing in, and he had nowhere left to turn. He had always believed that money, status, and power could solve any problem. But now, as he sat in his small, sterile apartment, he realized how wrong he had been. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his mother. "James, I've been trying to reach you. We need to talk. The media is turning against us. We can't afford to lose everything. Call me." He stared at the message, his hands trembling. The woman who had always been there for him, the woman who had built the Mitchell family legacy, was now urging him to call. But James knew what that meant. His mother was no longer the comforting figure she once was. She was a woman who had lost her power, and now she was clinging to whatever scraps of control she had left. James sank back into the chair, his mind racing. There was only one thing left for him to do: take responsibility for what he had done. But he didn't know if it would be enough to save him. Rebecca's final meeting with her legal team that afternoon was a turning point. The pieces were all in place. She had the evidence. She had the support. She had the moral high ground. And now, all she had to do was see it through. But even as she stood there, a quiet strength surrounding her, she couldn't help but think about James, about the man he had once been, about the man he had become. She had loved him. She had given him everything. But in the end, he had chosen his ego over her. And now he would face the consequences.